We are today. We are starting a new series. It's called "Deliver Us from Nowhere," and we mentioned several months ago we started talking about this series because we needed your help, and a lot of you went on and filled out. We basically submitted to the community like, hey, what are some questions? What are some things that you would like us to talk about? What are some things that you wish a sermon might address for one reason or another? And we ended up getting more than 70 different answers. And what we tried to do as best we could was group those answers into sort of categories and types of questions. Because a lot of times you'll see three different questions and they're worded differently, but then if you sort of dig down, you realize like, oh, this is actually the same question being asked in three different ways. And so what we tried to do as best we could is come up with the questions that would kind of show up the most. And that's what we ended up doing now. So if we don't get to the question that you submitted, we still have it, and there are still opportunities later on down the road for us to reintroduce these ideas into other sermons. But what we wanted to do mostly was take the questions that we felt like were mostly being asked, like again, throughout the community, and address those as best we could. So that's kind of what we'll be doing as we move into this series. And the series came about, I remember we were, speaking of small groups, we were in our small group way back in the early spring, and we were meeting at somebody's house, and one of the people in our small group basically just started talking about like all the different things that she grew up hearing and being told, like, this is right. This is the right way to see things. This is the right way to talk about things and to do things. And then growing into adulthood and meeting new people and attending the well, all of a sudden it's like, oh, like sometimes, like some of these like very easy kind of like cliched answers that I was given as a child or as a teenager, like all of a sudden these don't make as much sense to me anymore. And so in that conversation, it sort of became clear, like, oh, I bet there's a lot of people in our community who have a similar like set of questions or a similar posture to this whole thing. And so that's kind of where we started with this whole series. So people who are basically processing and trying to work out their relationships with beliefs that they were handed when they were younger that maybe don't make a lot of sense anymore as we get older. And we begin asking questions about like, well, am I wrong? Am I losing my faith? Am I drifting away from like my calling or whatever? Or is there something else going on here? So again, we asked you to provide questions and suggestions, and that's how we basically determined what this series was going to look like. So each week we're going to talk about one type of question that we got. So one type of question that we saw several times was basically, I mean, to sum it up, it was basically like, is it even okay for me to be asking questions about my beliefs in the first place? Like, like I do have questions, but first of all, is it okay that I have questions? So a couple of the questions that we got, one was, can you address this is word for word what we got on one of the cards. Can you address the idea that people should not question anything regarding the Bible or church leadership because it would be disrespectful or blasphemous? Like, how many of us, like, yeah, we were like, maybe you were sitting in a Sunday school classroom one day, you raised your hand and asked a question, and some very well-meaning like volunteer told you, like, we don't ask those kinds of questions like that, or something else along the lines of like, I think before you ask questions like that, you should pray about it. And you should really think about like maybe your faith is struggling, and that's why you're asking this question in the first place. So basically shaming you for the question that you had in the first place. And then another version of this was basically, how do you keep going when you're experiencing doubt? And so several times we would have questions that kind of revolved around this notion of, yeah, what do I even do with this posture in the first place? Is it even okay that we're having this conversation? So what we wanted to do with this sermon to enter into the rest of the series, this sermon is basically going to be a permission slip for the rest of the series. Because before we can get into the rest of the questions that we're asking, we kind of have to deal with this kind of like the front door question of like, is it even okay that we have these questions? I think you probably can assume that based on the fact that we're going to spend 8 more weeks on this, like, yeah, it's probably okay. So, this is a real fear that people have. And it becomes like there's a point of anxiety of, is like, I have a question, but is it safe for me to ask this without being publicly shamed or like looked down upon in some sort of way, just for by virtue of the fact that I have the question at all. So, and this is, quite frankly, this is the thing of all the different conversations we're having in the series. This is the one that I probably spent the most amount of time thinking about. And it seems like, and again, it seemed like the perfect place to start the series because, again, like without this one, we don't really know if it's even okay to do the rest of them. So, and the reason I've spent a lot of time thinking about this is because I have been on this journey. This is a big defining thing that has sort of led me to where I am in terms of my own like point of like faith and beliefs. And I've some of the stuff. If you've been around and you've heard me talk, you've heard me talk about some of this stuff before. So sorry if this is going to sound like a rerun, but I just to kind of give everybody some context. So back in 2013. I was working at a church. I was a church that it was in the North Fort Worth area. Could be described as a mega church. It was like multiple locations, and video stuff and everything like that. And so, so I was working at this church, and I've been working at this church for about 4 years at this point. And I was a teaching pastor, which is basically what I'm doing right now. But then also behind the scenes, I was what could be described as a content creator. Now, let me explain how gross this is. So I say, like, not to be judgmental to anybody who still does this kind of work, but so basically, we had staff members and we had other teaching pastors at different locations. And so my job when I was hired, I was almost done with seminary. And so when I got hired to do this job, it was basically, I was hired as a teaching pastor, and then really quickly, the senior pastor asked me, he said, listen, he said, I need somebody to start ghostwriting sermons for me. And so, and that was part of my job description, and not just him, but all the other teaching pastors at the different locations. So I was writing the sermon outlines, and then I was writing study notes, and basically they would plug in their own like personal anecdotes to go along with. See, people are getting mad because I already did judgmental stuff. There they go. So, um, so I. So I would write these sermons, and then they would go out to the rest of the teaching staff, and then at 4 different locations, people would preach from these outlines that I wrote, and so they would, and so I was writing sermons for some weeks, like almost half a dozen people, and so I was responsible for the structure and tone of the message that the church was sending out on a regular basis. And sometimes that felt fine, and sometimes it felt weird. In fact, you should have been, when I told my preaching professor in seminary about my job, he looked at me like I had just landed from another planet. He was like, who in the world would want somebody else writing their sermons for them? So anyway, so so it was a weird job. It was one of the weirdest jobs that I've ever had. So at some point, in the middle of doing that job, I started asking some new questions. Basically, and it's a long story, and I will spare you all the details, but basically just sort of kind of beginning to wonder a little bit, are all the things that this church once said things that I actually believe in enough to say, because like I was not like, yeah, I was responsible for like crafting how the message was made, but I was not the final determiner of what the message itself was. Are you with me? So like there was always the guy above me who was basically saying like, no, I want it said this way, or I want a whole sermon about like how people need to be giving more, which is obviously something I'm not at all comfortable doing. So, so there would be like, so it was kind of like an on-demand sermon kind of situation where I was having to write content that I did not necessarily always agree with. And so I began to ask internally. I started asking lots of questions, which led to more questions, which kind of freaked me out. And it eventually led to a full-blown crisis of faith. And I would love to tell you that my full-blown crisis of faith came from reading like Kierkegaard or something like deep or whatever, but it came from watching Doctor Who. And This is absolutely true. So there is, I don't know how many Whovians we have in the room, but I was doing my very first all the way through binge of Doctor Who, because when you get done with seminary and you have small kids, like, yeah, when you got a little time, like, why not throw in a little Doctor Who? So there's an episode, if you will, there is an episode of Doctor Who in which, how many of you were expecting this to be part of the sermon today? So there's an episode of Doctor Who where the Doctor and his like human companion go to a planet where the whole planet is inside of a traffic jam. I don't know how many of you are. I'm seeing a couple of nods, like, ah, yes, I can name exactly that episode and tell you who wrote it and who started, whatever. So the whole episode takes place in a traffic jam, and so they're inside a car interacting with people who live on this planet who've been stuck in this traffic jam for as long as anybody can remember. And basically, and they're talking about like, well, what happens at the end of the traffic? Well, we believe one day the traffic will stop. One day we'll get out of this traffic jam. And some of you have been downtown in the middle of the afternoon and you're like, yeah, I get it. So there was this sense of like, yes, if you have enough hope, we will one day get out of this traffic jam. And every day at the exact same time, a song plays in all of the vehicles that are in the traffic jam. And the song is The Wonderful Cross. And so this was obviously, this was a whole episode that was written about sort of the notion of what if religion is an illusion. And so I watched this episode and I got done with the episode, no joke, like, seminary graduate. I'm like employee at a mega church, and I'm like, oh my gosh, what if none of this is real? You know what I mean? And so I remember like having a true, honest to goodness, like faith, full blown, like, what if none of this, like, truly. And I mean, it didn't like start and stop there. It was basically like I was already kind of like teetering on the edge of that exact moment. And then I watched that episode and it basically was just like bing, and it just like tipped me right over the cliff. And so I spent like a few weeks just truly like, I do not know if I believe any of the stuff that I'm preaching about or writing about at all, which is very scary if you work at a church and this is your livelihood. If your family's ability to eat and pay mortgage is based on, do I still believe the stuff that this church expects me to believe? And if you don't anymore, what do you do with that? And so it got real scary real fast. And so I started seeing a therapist, and that became pretty helpful. And at a certain point, it was sort of coaxed out of me by my senior pastor, because again, long story, but basically he found out that I was seeing a therapist, which should not be something that has to be found out, but whatever. And he started like asking me like very inappropriate questions about like, why are you seeing a therapist? And eventually I just kind of straight up was like, well, I'm beginning to ask some questions and I don't really know, kind of where I am with some things. And his first response to this was, don't tell anybody. He said, listen, he said, if people think that the teaching staff here isn't fully confident in what we believe, it's going to create lots of problems. And so I need you to tell no one that this is something you're dealing with. So, and I think the implied, the thing that went unsaid was like, if you do, your job is at stake. And so, I spent a couple of months truly, like kind of like very quietly kind of wrestling with this and not knowing what to do with it. There's also the fear, if you've ever been in this place, there's also the fear of if I tell the wrong person, not only will I have like shame or trouble or whatever, but like also like, what if I'm contagious? Like, what if I tell the wrong person? What if I tell somebody about this and then it makes them start thinking this way? And then all of a sudden I've created like an epidemic of people who don't know what they think or believe. And so like there's a real fear and loneliness to being in this place. And so I went in the middle of this, towards the end of it, in September of 2013, I went to a retreat in Southern California with some, I guess you could call them like spiritual thought leaders. And so I was at this retreat for a couple of days, and I knew that the guy who was leading the retreat had also sort of had a similar story, and so I at one point just started asking some questions. And the guy very helpfully, he told me, he said, okay, first of all, you need to understand two things. He said, first of all, this is normal. What you're going through is fully normal. And like if you spend enough time thinking about what you believe and about like how you got there to believe it. Eventually, you are going to come to a place where you're asking questions, you're interrogating your own, like, why do I believe the things that I believe? So it's totally normal. It's how we grow. It's how we evolve. It's how we learn more about God or about who we're trying to be or who we were created to be in this world. So that's the first thing. And he said the second thing is this: you can't go back. He said, you cannot turn around and pretend like you don't know the things that you know and pretend like you haven't thought the things that you've thought and asked the questions you've asked and seen the things that you've seen. You can never go back. So if you're trying to like put the toothpaste back in the tube, or you're trying to like make everything the way that it was before you started asking these questions, it's not going to happen. And all that's going to do is create more anxiety and more fear. And so, weirdly, later that week, I did lose my job at that mega church. And I told you before, like, it wasn't because of any of this. It's because I made a joke that nobody thought was funny. And that's true. And and again, I'm sure you're shocked to hear that. But anyway, so that was kind of shocking, and so it was painful. But honestly, like looking back, and I would never just admit this to the guy who fired me, but it did kind of set me free, and because it set me free to be fully honest about where I was and the questions that I had, and all of a sudden, like I wasn't like the existential fear of like, what if I tell the wrong person and I get fired? Like, oh, that's no longer a concern. And so all of a sudden I'm free to be honest, not just with myself, but with the other people in my life about kind of where I am with this. And so what ended up happening out of this, and again, it's a much longer story, but we started a church in North Fort Worth that was designed to create a space for people who needed this kind of framework. Basically, the whole thing began as like, listen, if you are in a place where you don't kind of know where you fit in and you're having questions about your own faith journey and you feel a little bit freaked out about that, we want to create a space where you can go and you don't have to worry about the stigma or the shame or the fear of, well, what if they won't accept me if they know that I'm asking these questions or whatever. And so we created a church specifically designed to have a space like that. And so lots of us, anyway, I realize that's a long story, but lots of us, I would imagine, depending on the tradition that you came out of and depending on where you were raised and what you were taught, what you were told you were supposed to believe, lots of us have been told that doubting or asking questions was bad or sinful or something like that. But we've also maybe been given a framework that doesn't seem to make as much sense as it used to. As we get older and as we begin to experience more of life and as we begin to think new thoughts and ask new questions, all of a sudden the very simplistic things that we were handed, a lot of times they stop working the way that they used to. And so maybe you were handed a map, and you at some point along the way you started realizing the map actually doesn't lead to anywhere. But it was a map that they handed me because they thought it would be that they thought I needed the map, but it turns out like no, the map is it doesn't go anywhere, or at least it doesn't go anywhere that I want to be. And so and then we feel guilty because, well, it must be our fault. It must be my fault that I'm experiencing questions or doubts, or that we're beginning to diverge from the narratives that we were handed. That all of a sudden I don't just like always agree with every single thing I hear in a sermon or on a Christian podcast or whatever. And again, this comes with a lot of fear, and not just if you work for a church, like there's an extra layer because there's your livelihood, but there's also the thing of like if you simply like attend a church and you're a part of a community and you start to sort of like all of a sudden you start to sort of wonder if the map goes where you want it to go. There's a lot of fear because like what if everything I've ever believed was wrong? That's a terrifying thing to ask yourself. Or even if these questions do lead me to a better, healthier place, what will it cost me? Will I still be a part of this community that I've always been a part of? Will I still have the same friendships that I've always had? Will I lose some amount of status in this community where I've gained some amount of like, respect? But if I start asking these questions and if I start verbalizing my thoughts, will I lose those kinds of things? Those are real fears. And I know people who have genuinely lost things because they've vocalized these questions. And so, and by the way, just as an aside, this is why it is so absurd when people refer to things like deconstruction and asking questions as a fad. Because like and maybe you've heard people say this. Like I've definitely like heard pastors or church leaders refer to like, well, this whole deconstruction fad. Like, listen, it's terrifying. There's nothing like, well, yeah, I think I'll just jump on this thing that might alienate me from my friends and family and make it to where I have no place to be when I need people the most. Like, yeah, that sounds great. I'll try that. Like, no, this is not a thing that we do voluntarily a lot of times. A lot of times you find yourself, not unlike myself, you find yourself in this place and you're thinking like, oh my gosh, I wish I could just turn it off so that I could go back to the way it was. But the thing is, you can't. You can't go back. And so again, who would ever choose this voluntarily? So if you ever are in this mindset and you hear somebody refer to this as like a trend or a fad or something that, yeah, everybody's just doing this because it's the thing to do. Like, what in the world are you? Who would choose this? Who would ever go through this kind of thing voluntarily? I would love to have been born and raised in a place where all the questions were all the answers always made sense, and the questions were always came with like an answer key. I would love that. I would imagine most of us would too. That's not how it works though. So here's the thing. If you are wrestling with doubts and questions, or if you're reevaluating the beliefs that you've always had and it's giving you a sense of fear or loneliness, you are not alone. You are not like, this is a totally normal experience. This is a healthy experience, I would argue. Please do not feel like you were alone when you were asking these questions or you were experiencing this, again, this deconstruction in whatever form it happens to be taking for you. It's part of the journey. It's healthy. It is nothing to be ashamed of. It is nothing to be I realize it brings a lot of fear, but truly it should not be something that makes us feel fear. It should be a thing that makes us feel wonder and curiosity. And so, but I think the fear comes from the question of like, what are the implications of this with the people that I consider part of my community? So, and you're probably sitting here wondering, like, are we gonna look at anything from the Bible, or are we just doing story time today? So, great question. Thank you for asking. So we will be looking now at the book of Genesis, chapter 32. So in the book of Genesis, so in Genesis 32, there's this story about a guy named Jacob, and Jacob has an interesting kind of story, and a lot of times we position Jacob as a hero of the faith. But the thing is, Jacob does a lot of really shady stuff. Like Jacob has a lot of problems. And so Jacob has lied, he has cheated, he has kind of stolen his brother's identity, and he has been on the run for quite some time. And everywhere he goes, he seems to be making more enemies. And so in Genesis 32, he's having what one might call a dark night of the soul, not unlike what some of us possibly have had in our own lives when we've been wrestling with certain questions or certain fears or certain doubts. And so Jacob is sitting by a river and he's having this dark night of the soul, and this very strange thing happens. So in Genesis 32, beginning in verse 24, it says, "So Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until daybreak." Now, first of all, we have like the man just shows up. Like the writer gives us no context on like, so this guy came along and challenged Jacob to a fight. Like, it doesn't give us any of that. It just says Jacob was left alone and a man wrestled with him until daybreak. When the man saw that he could not overpower him, he touched the socket of Jacob's hip so that his hip was wrenched, and he wrestled with the man. Then the man said, "Let me go, for it is daybreak," which is a weird, like, okay, the sun is coming up. I think we can be done now. So let me go, for it is daybreak. But Jacob replied, "I will not let you go unless you bless me," which is obviously what anybody would say when they're attacked by a stranger in the middle of the night. So he says, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." The man asked him, "What is your name?" "Jacob," he answered. Now, this is fascinating all by itself. And if you know the context of this, you know that there have been points along the way where Jacob has been asked his name in the past, and he always gives the wrong answer. Earlier in the story, Jacob goes to his blind father to try and basically trick his father into giving him a blessing that was meant for his older brother. And so when he goes in to his father, his blind father, and the father says, "Who are you?" Jacob answers, I'm Esau, which is the name of Jacob's brother. And so earlier in the narrative, when Jacob is asked, what is your name? Jacob gives a false answer. Here, Jacob gives the correct answer. He gives an honest answer. What is your name? Jacob, he answered. And then the man said, your name will no longer be Jacob, which, it took this long for Jacob to get to a place where he could say his own name. And now that he can, this stranger, this man in the night says like, okay, that's not your name anymore. And so it says, the man asked him, what is your name? Jacob, he answered. Then the man said, your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you have struggled with God and with humans and have overcome. Jacob said, please tell me your name. But he replied, why do you ask my name? Then he blessed him there. So Jacob called the place Peniel, saying, it is because I saw God face to face, and yet my life was spared. The sun rose above him as he passed Peniel, and he was limping because of his hip. Now, this is interesting for all kinds of reasons. But first and foremost, the word Israel here, now it says your name will be Israel because you have struggled with God and humans and have overcome. The word Israel literally means to wrestle or to struggle with God. So this community, which becomes the protagonistic community of the entire Hebrew scriptures, begins in a place, the name itself comes from this event. And it says, this person, this figure says, your name will be Israel because you have wrestled with God and with humanity. And so the defining characteristic of this new community that would go on to become, again, the protagonistic figure of the entire scriptures, the defining characteristic here is not they had more faith than anybody else. He doesn't give him a name that means like the most faithful, or even that they're more moral than anybody else. What is the one defining characteristic that the name describes? That they struggle with God. You have wrestled with God. The defining characteristic of this entire community is you have wrestled, you have struggled with God. Wrestling, struggling, asking new questions, challenging assumptions. These things have always been woven in to the DNA of the entire movement. The whole thing starts with the wrestling. And when we are told that those things are out of bounds, that you're sinful or that you should just pray harder and those questions will just go away. Like, whoa, the whole thing starts with wrestling. The whole story starts with a struggle. And if we deny the reality of the struggle, if we deny that the struggle is part of the story, then we deny the thing that gives this whole thing its momentum from the very beginning. The whole thing starts with wrestling and struggling and asking questions and really truly grappling with what exactly is it that we're doing here? What is it that I believe? We struggle with God, and that is the thing that gives this whole thing shape. And also, by the way, just as an aside, the very last thing that we learn about this, when Jacob leaves the encounter, how does it describe how he walks? He's limping. Because sometimes when we have these events, when we have these moments, when we have these things where we really have to challenge where we are and who we are and what kind of story we're participating in, we don't always walk away the same as we did when we entered into it. You can't go back. Sometimes we limp away. Sometimes it leaves itself, it kind of leaves us marked in a certain kind of way. I would imagine for those of us who have come out of certain faith traditions and certain faith communities, and we have been bold enough to ask these kinds of questions and to challenge certain assumptions and to really kind of push back against the things that we just always kind of took for granted. And then we got a response back that maybe was a little painful. Maybe we limped away from those encounters. Maybe you were sort of not necessarily forced out, but maybe sort of like encouraged out of a community or a space that you thought was your home. And then, maybe you found something healthier and something better, but maybe you limped for a little while before you did. So the struggle is part of it, but the limping is part of it too. So later on, this writer Paul is writing to one of the early churches in a letter called First Thessalonians. This is actually widely believed to be the oldest letter in the New Testament. And so one of the things that Paul says towards the end of this letter in 1 Thessalonians 5, beginning of verse 19, he writes this. He says, "Do not quench the spirit. Do not treat prophecies with contempt, but test them all. Hold on to what is good. Reject every kind of evil." What is another word for test? Question, examine, wrestle, struggle. Do not simply assume that something is right or something is wrong just because you heard it at church camp one time. Do not just like take everything at face value just because you overheard it in a Sunday school class however many years ago it was that you heard it. I'm not saying that those things are always wrong. A lot of times they're probably not. But the question is like, is it okay for me to begin asking the next question and to peel back the layers? Or are those kinds of things out of bounds? And I think the scriptures, what they're saying here between the wrestling and the test everything are like, no, you are allowed. You are allowed to ask these questions. You are encouraged to ask these questions. It's part of it. It is a healthy, necessary part of it. And I'm sure there are those in the room, or at least listening online, who are thinking like, yeah, but what about where it says like the Jesus says we're supposed to have like childlike faith? You know what I mean? Like, and this is something I would hear when I was a pastor, and I would talk about this. Like, well, aren't we supposed to have childlike faith? Let me ask you something. Have you ever met a child? Like, because the thing that we all know about children is they never ask any questions. I don't know if you've met my 13-year-old daughter, but it's a press conference. Every conversation, you need to cite your sources and you need to be prepared for anything. So the question of like, well, yeah, we should have childlike faith. Don't ask any questions. Like, again, like I think maybe we've never met children before if we think that that means asking no questions. So all of this to say, you are allowed, is it okay for me to ask questions? Is it wrong? Is it sinful for me to have questions and to push back and to challenge certain assumptions? Like, no, it is not wrong. In fact, we are invited to do that. The thing that defines the whole beginning of the story is the wrestling and the struggling with God. And if this is not you, if you have always sort of had an easy time sort of engaging and embracing like when you read scripture or you hear sermons and it's sort of, it kind of, you just sort of absorb it and it's great and you're happy with it. That is wonderful. I'm so happy that that has been your experience, but it has not been a lot of our experiences. And for those of us for whom it has not been our experience, that's okay. There's nothing wrong with you. There's nothing broken about that. It is a healthy part of your journey. It's normal. It's built in to the story. And it is something you are invited to do as much as you need to do it. Test everything is what Paul says. So a couple of thoughts to just sort of like kind of wind us down a little bit. The first thought is our moments of most profound growth are often born out of disruption. A lot of times when everything is normal and whatever you were handed when you were 8 and it stays the same for the rest of your life, like a lot of times what that might imply is the question of like, has anything ever challenged you? And like, are there any questions that maybe we need to be asking? And yeah, like the moments of disruption are scary and they're painful, and a lot of times they do come with something of a cost. But those are moments of disruption. And I would like, looking back at my own personal experiences and my own story, like the moments of disruption are the things that got me to where I am. Like I would not hold the same views, opinions, ideas that I currently have had it not been for the disruptions. The disruption often is the thing that we need to push us towards some amount of growth. Otherwise, everything just sort of stays at the same frequency, and there's very little engagement or movement or evolution at any sort of meaningful level. A lot of times, we need things to be challenged, so that we need disruption, so that we can grow in a healthy, necessary way. A lot of the time. The second thing, I want to invite everybody to honor your path. Everybody has it is probably at a different place in their journey. Everybody here, I would imagine, is somewhere like there's a wide spectrum of I feel great about everything that I believe, and I don't know at all what I believe, and I'm sure we're all sort of somewhere in the middle. And so wherever you are on that, my hope is that you will come to a place where at the very least you can honor your own journey, and you can sort of acknowledge, like, yeah, this is where I am. I can name sort of where I am with this whole thing, and it's okay. And I can honor where I am in this, and also honoring the journeys of others, because the people around me aren't necessarily where I am in this whole thing, and that's okay. Because again, you can't go back. We can't turn around and pretend like we didn't hear the things that we heard, or learn the things that we learned, or ask the questions that we asked. So yeah, honoring our paths, and then the next thing is, don't fear your own questions. I think you probably are asking your questions for a reason. And I think there's probably something kind of driving that curiosity, and suppressing that and ignoring it, like it won't go away, and it won't be a thing that you can just like push aside and suppress until one day you're not thinking about it anymore. Go ahead and don't be afraid of your questions. Ask your questions. And which but also, as you ask those questions, I'm going to invite you to ask those questions in a space. I'm going to invite you to ask those questions in a space that is safe for you. Because yeah, there will be honestly, there will be times when you articulate this to somebody, and their response, not unlike my former employer, will be, "Listen, don't tell anybody," and that's not helpful. So don't be afraid of your own questions. Find a space where you can engage your questions at an honest level, which is the last sort of invitation, observation, whatever, which is, you don't have to go through this alone. Again, lots of us have been in this place. Lots of us have had questions. It's healthy. So find someone who is a good listener and safe to talk to. I mentioned before, like, I started seeing a therapist, which was really helpful, and I still do. And so it is. I find that it can be very healthy and useful to have a space where you go, where there is time carved out for these kinds of conversations. Now, I will say, not to just throw shade at Christian counselors in the room, but if your therapist is a Christian counselor, and their only response to you to you sort of going through all of this, and their only response is, "Well, have you prayed about this?" If that's all they've got for you, it's time to find a new therapist. I realize, like, there are lots of Christian counselors who are very helpful and are really great at walking other people through this. I have known people who have gone to Christian counselors, and that is literally like all they've got. And so at that point, maybe go find somebody who can kind of meet you where you are, and won't give you sort of the greeting card version of what sounds like helpful advice, but is not at all. Some people will not be able to help you. Some people will not be able to go there with you. There will likely be people who will want to say things like, "Well, you just need to pray about this harder," or, "If you had more faith, then you wouldn't be asking so many questions." And you're like, "Yeah, that's kind of the point. So that's why I'm here asking you more questions." So, the invitation is not to have so much faith that we leave our curiosity behind. The invitation is to wrestle, and to struggle, and to test everything. Another important point, and this was one that was very difficult for me to learn, is you cannot expect other people to go with you at the same pace that you're going. Not everyone is ready at the same time. Not everyone has the same, like, entry points and curiosity. Not everybody watches Doctor Who. And so, like, there will be times when you will be having a conversation, and it feels like we're just not really hearing each other, and maybe that's okay, and maybe and again, we're all at different points in the journey, and you can't drag somebody with you. You cannot expect somebody to be curious in the same form that you are. The best we can do is offer grace to each other as best we can. And again, this was a hard one for me. Um, but their journey may not be the same as yours, and that has to be okay. So all the way back around to where we started, which is, can we have doubts? Are we allowed to have questions? Obviously, yes. It is normal. It is healthy. It's how we grow. It's how we evolve. The whole story begins with, because you wrestled with God. So may you test everything. May you embrace disruption and curiosity. May you see that you are not alone, and the wrestling and the questioning and the testing, it's all part of the story. It's all part of the journey, and you are invited, not just allowed, you are invited to meet those questions exactly where you are and to engage your curiosity and your wonder in whatever way feels healthy and productive to you, because you can't go back, but we can grow. We can experience the disruption. We can embrace the curiosity and the wonder, and we can begin to grow and evolve and allow ourselves space to wrestle and to struggle. So may we do that.